Hi, everyone. I'm Carl Girth. I'm a professor of modern Chinese history here at UCSD. Welcome, everyone, to this event hosted by the 21st Century China Center of GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UCSD. Our guest today is Margaret Hillenbrand, my former colleague from Oxford. Margaret did her undergraduate degree at Cambridge and then did her DPhil at Oxford. She is the author of 3 very provocative books: Literature, Modernity, and the Practice of Resistance. In 2020, the book Negative Exposure, with my favorite subtitle, Knowing What Not to Know in Contemporary China. We'll have to ask her about that one in the Q&A. And the book that she's here to talk about today, On the Edge, Feeling Precarious in China. Margaret will talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have question and answer to the top of the hour. Just as a reminder, this is a hybrid format. There are people watching, and we're also being recorded.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me, Carl. It's particularly wonderful to be in such a sunny place after leaving Oxford, where it had rained solidly for the last 5 months. Everywhere is flooded. So yeah, thank you for your very kind introduction. Today I'm going to be talking about my new book, which is called On the Edge, Feeling Precarious in China. And it explores precarity in contemporary China through the lens of the dark and angry cultural forms which chronic insecurity has generated since the millennium or so. So this talk is a kind of introduction to the book, and I begin with an anecdote's the wrong word, an incident, a very important moment in this process of precarious feeling. It's about an event that occurred in 2017. Fire is a very routine peril for the migrant settlements that fringe the outskirts of Beijing. These are perimeter places, and they're tightly packed with people who dwell in cramped spaces alongside chemicals and machines which are serviced by outdated electric wiring and communal cookers in the corridors. So once a fire is ablaze, it can rip very explosively through these shanties, and it leaves very little time and space for escape. But fire can pose even crueler threats to those who live in these urban twilight zones, as residents of the Daxing district found to their cost in the winter of 2017, in this incident that I'm talking about. On the evening of November the 18th, a blaze broke out in the cold storage basement of a 2-story building in Daxing Xinjian urban village, which is located just outside Beijing's 6th Ring Road. At least 19 people, including 8 children, died in the flames. But in the days that followed, locals had very little chance to mourn. Before the gutted building was even really put out, the fire was put out, the local authorities had issued an eviction order for Xinjiang, using fire safety as its rationale. So essentially, the city government used this rationale to condemn the entire settlement. And perhaps as many as 250,000 people were forced to evacuate their homes. Their workshops and small businesses were shuttered, stock spilled out onto the sidewalk, chaos reigned on the freezing cold streets. And here are some images, if I can get this going. Yeah, here we go, of those days. Bulldozers rolled in and flattened the makeshift structures in which only a few days earlier a dense ecology of people had had their being. And these sorts of desolate photos that you can see now, they show numbed faces, abandoned toys, pedicabs piled high with toys and hastily packed possessions. For some migrants, though, even a return to their rural roots was impossible, since land dispossession in the countryside since the 1990s has steadily unraveled even that safety net. So in one sense, these numbed faces, these abandoned toys, they suggest that the Daxing fire and the evictions that followed it are an object lesson in what Naomi Klein has called disaster capitalism. I know Carl doesn't like capitalism as a topic, but I'm going to stay away from that. According to this shock doctrine, which as she calls it, traumatic events, either natural or man-made, they crack open portals of opportunity, basically, through which governments can then railroad socioeconomic change, which their subjects, who are still reeling from a sense of catastrophe, are very ill-equipped to fend off. So, as Klein puts it, it's in these malleable moments, this is the quote I'm looking for, yeah, when we're physically unmoored and physically uprooted, that these artists of the real plunge in their hands and begin their work of remaking the world. Now, the district of Daxing had long suffered under what Loïc Wackel calls a blemish of place. It warehouses migrants of varied skill sets, whose services Beijing needs, but whose living, breathing personhood it prefers not to encounter at close quarters. I say needs, but needed might be the better term here, actually, since plans were already afoot before the fire to reduce Beijing's migrant population. And this point is driven home by the fact that there were very few relocation options offered to the dispossessed after that order to leave. And if social cleansing formed one part of the eviction agenda, the lucrative possibilities of land requisition, they obviously constitute the other. So there's a strong sense of disaster capitalism lingering here amid the blaze. But Klein's study of state pillaging also includes a quotation from the Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano, which is maybe even more relevant. He asks, how can this inequality be maintained if not through jolts of electric shock? So I think what he means by this is bringing it back to Daxing as a ramshackle settlement, which is right next to a very sleek metropolis. Daxing emblematizes inequality already, it emblematizes exclusion, but it did so long before the fire and the evictions of November 2017, like many other of China's urban villages, which have sprung up on the outer rims of big cities. Its status as a site of stigma was already very well established. These island-like slums, as they've been called, they form archipelagos of disenfranchisement. Their denizens mostly lack urban household registration, hukou, and they're thus denied access to public services such as local schools, housing, and healthcare. They work jobs without contracts in workplaces without security. And for a time, the local government actually called them the low-end population, or diduarenko, in policy documents. So as such, they have for a very long time counted among China's most precarious people. But what kind of change then, or to use Galeano's words, what electric shock might the evictions mark? Or to put this differently, what does it mean to be officially banished from a place of already de facto exile? What's the difference? Well, when I began my book, I thought it would be a study of the relationship between precarity and cultural practices in China. I wanted to explore precarious life and labor through the prism of the vibrant and often very iconoclastic cultural forms, which chronic uncertainty has been generating for a long time now, both in China and of course elsewhere. I'm thinking of garbage art, protest performance over wage arrears, poetry from the factory floor. These are some of the things I wanted to look at. I was really struck by how precarity, which has been so extensively theorized elsewhere, had only very recently begun to enter the conceptual lexicon of China researchers, except for a very small number of essentially labor scholars, I think. So ultimately, what I hoped to do was situate Chinese experience more centrally within our global understanding of precarity by exploring how frayed securities, frayed sense of safety are shaping practices of culture in the world's second most populous country. So this project from the very beginning, it was premised on the idea that Chinese experience surveyed through a cultural studies lens might deepen and sharpen our understanding of precarity as a keyword of this current moment. And whether we understand precarity as a condition which arises essentially from labor practices, or more kind of philosophically as a state which besets every person precisely because they're human and therefore vulnerable to plague and to pain. A study of precarity in China, I thought then, it would add some shading and some nuance to these established parameters of debate. But the fire and the evictions, they cast things in a different light. They maybe changed my mind. And maybe wonder and said about the intensifying relationship between precarity and banishment. As I've already suggested, Shenzhen urban village was a site of precarity long before the fire and the bulldozers. After that, it became something a bit closer to a non-place. Its former residents can no longer be called that name because their dwelling places have been demolished. So like the non-place that they once inhabited, they were cast by the evictions into a limbo, which impinged really on their very right to existence. As nomads denied a birth in the city and frequently barred from return to the countryside, as I've mentioned, their fate actually invokes questions about the limits of inequality, the limits of exclusion as meaningful terms, as meaningful descriptors of contemporary social conditions. And it's these limits which have prompted Saskia Sassen, amongst others, to argue that we're now witnessing the emergence of a new logic of expulsion in the global political economy. Now, this new momentum takes us, as she puts it, beyond the more familiar idea of growing inequality as a way of capturing the pathologies of today. It recognizes that the language we use to describe immiseration, to describe unbelonging on a really systematic scale, that language is now too tepid. Crucially, Saskia Sassen defines expulsion in really broad and open ways, as you can see here. Expanding the semantic meaning of expulsion like this, it has quite strong political potential, but it also, I think, finesses or elides an anomaly at the very heart of the meaning of exile. To expel is to cast out, and if that prefix ex has to be acknowledged really, if we're going to let that meaning hold, let that term hold its proper sense. You can sort of dismiss this as just a bit of a linguistic quibble if you simply argue that expulsion is never conceived in spatial terms alone. It always encompasses economic, social, legal, emotional excommunication. But actually, in an age when national sovereignty norms make cross-border banishment pretty much impossible, the fact remains that people who are purged from the polis, they have no next place to go. They must stick within the bounded territoriality of the nation state, and actually often much closer to hand as land dispossession in rural areas right across the globe continues apace. And this sense of internal exile, that's the precondition for what I'm looking at in this book. The inability of contemporary states to export their human surplus to penal colonies as they once did. The fact that they can't cast their surplus beyond the social pale for which there's no return. They can't discharge it into the sea like plastic waste. That means that not only civic death has to morph into new forms, but that these mutations, they stay visible within the social world. Banishment is, of course, a very visual process. This is what Matthew Gibney is talking about when he notes, I'm quoting, banishment removes the offender from public view and thus decreases the likelihood of a spiral of revenge and retaliation, which would upset the civil peace, unquote. So when you can't execute banishment visually, so when society's outcasts stay within its direct line of sight, this ritual, if you like, of punitive purging, it's blocked, it stops working, and in ways that do actually upset the civil peace. And this disharmony becomes even more jarring when you get governments engaging in what we might call flexi expulsion, which is the process where people are exiled from the city until they become useful again, and then meanwhile they're suspended in states of civic half-life. So I began thinking about what this widespread internal exile meant, this internal exile which happens via dispossession, via disenfranchisement. And I think ultimately it creates what is a warped socio-legal condition. And I call this state of being zombie citizenship. And it's a zone actually in which quite a significant minority of people in China currently languish. And this term very explicitly invokes the idea of the living dead, and it tries to conceptualize both the sort of civic non-personhood I just mentioned above, but also its impact on those who, for now at least, are spared that fate. So the crucial backdrop to this idea of zombie citizenship is Article 1 of the Chinese Constitution, which states, and I quote, that the People's Republic of China is a socialist state under the People's Democratic Dictatorship led by the working class and based on the alliance of workers and peasants, unquote. So it's very clear here that Chinese workers are symbolically enshrined at the very vanguard of national life. They technically enjoy full, if not actually special, personhood under the law. But many millions actually experience violent cognitive dissonance, really, as both the national constitution and the law of the land are stripped of substance in lives which are lived in sliding states of expulsion. And this is why I think we can call their citizenship zombie. It's the corroded carcass, really, of the more fully fleshed civic identity which people born in the polis by birthright get to have. So to an extent, this notion of zombie citizenship, it shares space with what scholars of civic rights have called stratified citizenship or differential citizenship. And these are all really valuable terms because they make the vital point that belonging and expulsion don't exist on some sort of simple in-out binary scale. They lie along a continuum. But these definitions are also a lot less loaded and inflammatory than the word zombie. So zombies, as you know, they're beings without speech, without agency, without free will, without rational thought. They're resurrected from the dead, but they're devoid of human qualities. Zombies, it epitomize then the state of existing in a kind of mindless thrall to the dark power of others. So in this sense alone, the term is obviously a completely unacceptable way to describe already chronically disadvantaged people. So, I mean, it adds gross insult to grievous injury, in other words. So I should make it very clear that I don't try and use the term zombie here to refer to actual people. Instead, I'm using the phrase zombie citizenship to describe the kind of civic abjection, the exile from the law, into which some people are cast in our current precarious era. This is an enforced zone of existence then, rather than a kind of flesh and body identity. And I use this term because it captures the sense in which many working people in China, like the original zombies of Haitian folklore, they're locked in forms of quasi-slave labor. And they're cut adrift from the law, they exist only for the benefit of others. And this makes their state quite fearsome because they've obviously got every right to seek revenge for the maltreatment that they endure. And so their rebellion always hovers at the edge of the horizon. And this figure of the living dead, it also captures the paradox of banishment when there's no next place to go. It embodies the sense of threat, which surges when segments of society are rendered into surplus matter, but they can't be physically purged. And finally, the presence of the undead who are close at hand and harboring the threat of contagion, that captures the fear that anyone and everyone in a society which applies the shelter of the law capriciously might find themselves cast into a similar state. So the central point that I try and make in my book is that this ambient mood of civic jeopardy, if you like, it shapes the contemporary experience of precarity in China at its core. Now, I'm not trying to deny here for a moment that precarious feeling is also tied to both labor practices and to human vulnerability at the deepest level. Those exiled to zombie citizenship are by their very definition tethered to casualized work. And their lack of protection from the law leaves them defenseless in ways which touch very excruciatingly on what Judith Butler has called what it means to have or not have a grievable life. But if we're going to grapple with what it means to feel precarious in China, we also need to consider the impact on society of witnessing at close quarters the process where you get state policies effectively carving out an underclass which is consigned to this fate. And to watch this process is inevitably to feel its menace. It's to wonder who's next. And there's a growing body of research that's shown that a sense of fear trails the witching hours of even people who should by rights feel a lot more privileged and secure, but who face a kind of anxious mismatch between their long-held expectations and their actual living or working conditions. So I'm thinking here of university graduates, entry-level trainees, small-scale entrepreneurs, cultural creatives, IT employees, people in the 996 working system, and so on. Now, I call this trepidation a fear of the cliff edge. This is the slow slide or the sudden tumble into states of penury and risk and civic danger, basically. And as it looms, this imminent fall exacts a kind of toll. It breeds strife. It breeds friction among social classes. And this unease, of course, it's not exclusive to China, just as expulsion itself is a logic which is running right across the world. So I'm not trying to argue that there's something kind of exotic or exceptional about Chinese experience in a world where everything really is precarious. But I do think that Chinese experience can illuminate this condition of surety under siege in some very vivid ways. So the vast size of and thus the unmissable visibility of China's underclass, that's a factor. The dark memories, whether they're firsthand or inherited, of the class violence which raged not so long ago. The silencing of class as a category of political action, even as what is effectively a caste system has come into being, together with the sense of unease that you get when such blatant truths are suppressed. Then you get the huge governmental power of the Chinese state, a power which inevitably impacts the most vulnerable the most absolutely, the emergence of a social credit system which proliferates the codes for good citizenship at the same time as remaining subject to what can always be a catastrophic kind of error. And of course, the web of surveillance, which monitors civic conduct, civic misconduct. Now, I think this matrix of factors makes contemporary China a very important site for the study of the cliff edge as a divisive structure of feeling. And here again, the fire tells us quite a lot. The evictions caused real outrage right across the social spectrum. They sparked a petition to the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. Ava Pills has actually argued that the case marks a rare moment when advocates from different spheres of China's segregated society, as she puts it, came together to find a shared language of citizenship. And if so, it was a sort of heartfelt anxiety over the civic death which had been meted out to the citizens of Xinjiang, which animated this sense of solidarity. And the petition made that clear. It argued that government actions had violated 5 constitutional rights of Chinese citizens: land rights, individual or private economic rights, private property rights, the rights to the inviolability of human dignity, and housing rights. And this is why Pills comes up with this persuasive claim that this was a moment in which people came together as they worried about the precarity of their rights. And this outrage, this solidarity also took cultural form in a documentary by Huayong entitled After the Great Fire, or Da or Zhihou, which tracked the horror of the evictions. So since 2017, there's been a kind of consensus really emerging that the evictions, despite their violent dislocation, they also fostered shoots of civic awareness. They fostered social conscience, interclass fellowship, and so forth. And in many ways, these arguments about solidarity are very seductive. And they belong as part of a rallying cry, which has many parallels across the globe in the work of the many activists who see precarity as the banner under which divided people can come together. But in my book, what I try to do is make a sort of counter case. And I begin with the fire, but in the rest of the book, I journey back through time to put together a kind of freight of cultural evidence, which tries to unsettle the idea that fear and dread of zombie citizenship are just going to naturally alchemize into feelings of solidarity. And I think in the case of Daxing, this idea of solidarity has been very wildly overstated. So far, scholarly attention has focused on the support for the evictees that was expressed on social media, the clever ways in which people got round censorship and so on. But this is only part of a much bleaker story, I think. So, for example, I looked at responses posted on the WeChat or Weibo news accounts of major national and municipal news outlets, and they reveal a lot of support for the evictions. At the kinder end of the spectrum, netizens were saying that buildings in Xinjiang were illegal, so demolishing them was the only way to protect life. Others praised the municipal government for enforcing the law strictly. Others again supported the evictions because Xinjiang residents were squatting against the law in a city which is apparently already overrun with migrants who sully its image as China's glossy capital. But then there were harsher voices which taunted, why don't you just go home? Or low-end workers should just get out of Beijing. All in all, out of 111 responses to 21 news articles, nearly 72% of the comments that I viewed supported the government's decision to evict the fire-stricken residents of Xinjiang into a wintry November night. Now, of course, you can counter-argue that these spaces are exactly the kind of online sites which are routinely targeted by the so-called 50th party, the troops who pepper spray cyber discourse with fake pro-state messaging. So I looked at some other sites too. I looked at 168 responses, this time looking at the comments section of articles from a broader range of sites, like Baidu, like Wancha, like Epoch Times, like Caixin and Sohu. And they bring the picture closer to 50-50. But these numbers still throw some really significant shade on the rosy vision of some sort of surging multilateral solidarity. Now, of course, solidarity is a thing. Evidently, the condition of zombie citizenship does make people feel fellow feeling for each other, and that's an important sentiment. But the focus on sincere support across class lines, which has dominated analysis of the evictions, it's skewed, I think, towards hopefulness in a disproportionate way. And this is unhelpful because it blocks a fuller analysis of how the cliff edge can also eat away at our social sinews. In the book, I try to balance this rosiness with a different set of proofs about the toll that state-sanctioned forms of expulsion can take. And the case studies that I look at suggest that jeopardy can curdle into a kind of social poison, really, as the spectre of zombie citizenship stirs up strife between different groups. China, as we know, is a harmonious society. The class struggle that racked the Maoist years has been so thoroughly overcome that now the very word class or 阶级 has been kind of rendered almost unsayable. But when you get a society which is supposedly without class, at the same time as one which has a huge cast of de facto untouchables, this is such a vast and visible anomaly that propaganda can only really paper it over. Precarity spawns ugly feelings, and they don't just conveniently dissipate amid state hype about social harmony, and culture is where they often break out. In my book, I argue that the threat or the reality of the cliff edge is now a significant force which shapes contemporary culture. And I look at dubious performance art, I look at waste art, suicidal protest movements, poetry from the factory floor, and short video apps. These are all cultural forms born in the crucible of Chinese precarity and its divisive affects. They're also new forms that break out in terms of their genre and their shape. They reveal how cultural expressions can morph under the threat of zombie citizenship and the social frictions which it stirs. But these cultural practices are never just about representing class tension. They don't just simply reflect it. Culture is actually a key site where strife about class happens in China, as precarious feelings turn garbage dumps and construction sites into vital vectors of the contemporary moment in which art and life can't really be segregated from one another. Crucially, these practices are not born of isolatable class interests, so they're not about urban middle class, rural city migrant, and so on. Instead, they emerge from the generative clash between competing interests in an era when the loud rhetoric of the China dream is shot through with softer chat about how some must suffer or even be sacrificed if that fantasy is to be made real. This is what Elizabeth Perry said a long time ago about divide and rule and how it's always served the Communist Party in China very well. If society is harmonious, this is a very tense and fragile piece, which is predicated on a highly judicial pecking order in which everyone's racing to avoid the bottom rung. Of course, these cultural works do harbour the potential for fellowship, but just as often they're the means via which rivalry, exploitation, protest and control are articulated, and through which class difference is asserted. As such, these are practices which are a lot harsher than many humanists would like. But at the same time, I think they also testify to culture's role as a place, as a paramount place where politics happens. In fact, I think we should see these practices as vibrant expressions of agency among people who experience or who fear they will experience a deadening of their capacity for will and action and identity. As you probably know, in recent times, apathy in China has been drawing a lot of attention. There's stuff like this, Ge You Tan, or there's stuff like this, Tang Ping. These movements are vernacular expressions of protest against the status quo of life and labor in China, and they deliberately use a language of passivity. They show the subversive potential of opting out, staying supine, tactically disengaging. Instead, I look at practices which absolutely reject passivity. They're the sort of raging anti-inert. And as such, I think they restore a sense of the riotous and the unmanageable to precarity as a condition. They acknowledge that undisciplined feeling, antagonism, in other words, is a very legitimate response to the cliff edge as a threat or as a reality. Ugly feelings are creative, and never more so when the right to civic belonging is at stake. So to wind this up, I don't think that these fractious forms I've been talking about, they're not really about holding up a looking glass to social realities. Instead, I think they're about creating sort of symbolic fire pits in which smouldering tensions can ignite. They give free rein to really negative feelings. But if we're going to probe or even challenge the binaries between citizen and non-citizen, insider and outsider, people who are deserving and people who are not, then the friction which arises from, on the one hand, the intimate coexistence, and on the other hand, the tight interdependency of different social groups, that friction, that needs attention. And this kind of proximity, it's not just tense and creative, it's also transformative. It forces people to acknowledge each other face to face, even if that recognition happens amid conflict. And as people come together like this, they intuit both their sameness and also the constructed nature of the barriers that divide them. This isn't the soothing balm of cultural solidarity then, but I think that the fear and fury of shared vulnerability at a time when exile and belonging lie on an increasingly slippery scale, they're subjects which are really deserving of study, since at any point this kind of commonality, it might catalyze new reactions of its own. What might these reactions be? Well, I don't know. Is it conceivable that anything good might come of them? I don't have the answers to these questions. But when I look back on the writing of this book and the cultural forms it describes, I'm always struck by the force of the passions which animate these sorts of cultural practices and to which they themselves often give rise. And it's this sort of bristling energy, really, more than the darkness itself, which might offer a way forward, I think. When we think about civic status, it's traditionally linked to civility in contemporary China as in ancient Rome. And this is a civility which is well-mannered, which is gracious, it's disciplined, and so on. It's all about harmony again. But the cultural makers that I look at in this book, they really subvert these code words for citizenly membership, but they do so precisely to state or to maintain their claim to the polis. They disobey in the hope that they might belong. The results are messy, but precisely because they suggest that not only that citizenship is worth fighting for, even getting one's hands dirty over, but that as a social norm, it may also require this kind of ongoing definitional struggle if it's going to remain meaningful. And I will leave it there. Thank you for listening.
we're meant to
Sit down.
take a seat here. I think I'll take my right to ask the first couple of questions, but we have plenty of time, 25 minutes. Yeah, thank you. I think you made a very compelling case for investigating precarity. But when I think of what do I envy about literature professors, I envy their ability to go deep inside people's psyches. And I'm wondering if you have examples that sort of demonstrate, you've laid out that we should expect to find this in people's psyches, this feeling of unsettledness. And I'm wondering maybe you could go into one or another of your examples and describe what's there, what sort of sources you use to find what sort of emotion.
Okay, well, one of the chapters that I wrote for the book is about suicide shows. Suicide shows happen when aggrieved workers in the construction industry who've not been paid by their wicked bosses essentially scale skyscrapers or high-rise buildings and threaten to jump off unless they're paid. And this was, I found a lots of these suicide shows online. And as I started studying them, I was struck by two things. First of all, that they were incredibly emotional, to get back to your point about affect, because you can hear what people are saying on the soundtrack, and they're talking about desperate lives, about how the failure to be paid their wages means that they can't go home for Chinese New Year, they can't see their families who they haven't seen for months, their marriages are in jeopardy, their access to their children is under threat. So there's a surging emotionality in these performances, but at the same time, they follow quite a strict repertoire. They have a kind of practice feel to them. That they're a form of process which people have honed and developed over hard work, and sometimes actually investment from not financial investment, but sort of instruction from middle class NGOs and so on, who've helped to guide these protesters in developing this language of remonstrance. So you've got this combination of really high emotion and also a sense of performativity, because these are performances which are both staged and not staged. They're unfolding in real time, and you can see that when people's bodies quiver, and when you can hear the wind howling, and you feel the jeopardy. And what I found really interesting about these performances is that for some media commentators in China really object to them and call these men showmen. They call them charlatans. They argue that this is basically a fake practice just designed to get money. But when I've presented about this practice and talks and stuff, other people have said to me, "Well, this isn't performance. This is this kind of blatant political protest. Well, how can you put any kind of performativity or artistic meaning on this?" So for some people, these are too showy. Other people, they're not showy enough. I think what we see here is a kind of reflex of discomfort that a lot of people feel when subaltern people who are down and out actually start to mobilize culture to get their rights back. So that's an example of what I'm talking about, of how this is a practice like all the practice I talk about, which is full of emotion, but at the same time also highly cultural, practiced, performative.
Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah, I could follow up with any number of methodological questions that might be relevant for historians, but I'll just stick to my second question and ask the tried and true historian's question of what is new here. Certainly in the Mao era, we see plenty of what I guess nowadays is called gaslighting, of telling people you're experiencing something wonderful, you're experiencing something wonderful, don't believe otherwise. That seems to be what you're suggesting with our harmonious society as well. You have no right to feel class antagonism. We're living in a post-class harmonious society. So I'm kind of wondering, what's the change, and what is forcing that? What is responsible for that sort of change?
Oh, that's a very good point. Of course, the gaslighting precedes the period I'm talking about here, but I think there are two principal aspects of the reform era which lend a different kind of coloration to this sense of people being gaslit by their leaders. The first one is the Hukou system, according to which, as we all know, where you're born determines your access to fundamental rights. And the second is the discourse of suzhi, or human quality, which is a highly prejudicial, sort of pernicious system of value, which dictates what social rightness means, the right deportment, the right accent, the right clothes, the right education. So I think people are consistently told, particularly migrant workers are consistently instructed by persuasive modes of propaganda and pedagogy, that if they hone themselves, if they improve their suzhi, then they can glide up the escalator to the promised land. They can glide up the escalator to the grail of a good life. But actually, this is a bait and switch. It's a classic bait and switch, because however hard you work at your suzhi, the fact that the hukou constrains opportunities so brutally, the fact that however hard you work, the rights are still going to be ring fenced according to birthright, which we might actually call a birth wrong in this case. I think that's a bit of a heist. That's a trick, and the trick's made even worse by the fact that the government's always promising, municipal governments and higher up are promising to always making these commitments to fixing the hukou system, but they so far have only really engaged in quite cosmetic tinkering. So I think that these two factors then neither, obviously suzhi is not new. It has roots way back in eugenics and the race for racial superiority, and hukou is not new either. But the way those two things have been mobilized as a kind of pincer movement, I think that's something different.
Yeah, I guess in my head, I would immediately thought of hukou, a fashionable topic for historians in the Mao era is the urban-rural divide,
Yeah.
the creation of that urban-rural divide, of course, predating hukou in the first place. The second, the people have the ability to move from the countryside to the city as they do. Why? Because they know already that they've been, that this is a striated society, and they have been put at a disadvantage. And I guess with suzhi off the top of my head, I think of the new socialist person also being held up as a norm with which the state could browbeat people into trying to get them to do things that they otherwise might not be willing to do, sacrifice more for the state in this case. So I guess I would have maybe a bit of a debate of how much newness there is there, but the
you're right.
part
The
seems
terms are not new, but their particular deployment within a neoliberal context, I think, has this punitive pincering effect, and I think that's what I was trying to get at. But I'm not trying to suggest that either of these, there's nothing new under the nice sun.
Postmates. Well, I could go on all day, but that wouldn't be fair to everybody else who's here today, as well as over the internet with us. So, Lei.
So maybe to continue with the question about the newness, I also struggle to understand what is new about the particular cultural forms that this precarity that you described has expressed itself. Right? You talked about these performative aspects, you talked about, but what I found missing is any sort of collective dimension to any of these things. Right? In the past, if you come, especially from sort of Marxian perspective, right? You see an underclass, there is a class in the formation. But there's also a class consciousness, class for itself, and they collectively organize, they resist. It seems like here, what you're describing is people are lying flat. They said, okay, I'm going to jump from a high-rise building. There's no sense of them doing anything for this particular group of people at all. And is that the new thing about precarity that you were describing, or
No,
are we is, in other words, is the Chinese state so powerful now that even as they condemn these population to some level of basically they can just kick you out, right? as you know, I studied migrants before, and the scene they described were not surprised to me. I mean, they happened in the 1990s and the 2000s. The migrants always lived on the edge. They were always blamed, and there were, you know, some collective, you know, movements try to get back their rights. And in this case, the landlords in the village might also have an interest at stake, right? So, but they seem to be not doing anything.
So,
Why is that?
we'll make sure I put your question straight. You're asking me what's new about the cultural forms themselves, or what's new about a lack of collectivity, or both?
Both.
Okay. In terms of the cultural forms, I think suicide shows are something a bit different. So are the skits that I looked at on Kuaishou, the live streaming app. And although factory poetry from the Foxglove Fours has been around for a while, I mean, it's certainly a reform era genre. I also look at delegated performance, which involves elite artists co-opting for a paltry sum migrant workers to perform degrading acts for them. I mean, these are, and I also look at waste art. And in terms of, from a cultural science perspective, these are cultural forms which are quite new. They're novel. They're innovative. They're breakout, as I suggested. They're breakout in their genre, in their form, in what they're attempting to do. So that, I think that's my answer to your first question. And my answer to your second question is absolutely yes. That what we're looking at here is atomization. That's the problem. What I found so disturbing and distressing about working on this project was what seemed to be a lack of in-class solidarity. It was a combination of a lack of in-class solidarity combined with tense and febrile conflict in between classes. So yes, that's why I tried to at least look for something to cling on to, something that was more hopeful. And that's why I tried to argue in the book that even in these moments of white hot antagonism, at least people are interacting with each other. At least there is contact, even if that contact is counterintuitively togetherness. It's not togetherness as we would like to imagine it. It's not the collective will. It's not class for class interests. But at least it's some kind of, it's a move away from I think what we're seeing on high, which is an attempt to keep people as divided as possible.
Matt.
A question from the chat. Bill Armbruster asks, roughly how many people in China today are living in precarity? And for comparison purposes, roughly how many people in the US and or the UK are living in precarity? And I will add that you can address that as a proportion of population.
Well, I think that this is a really core question. And it's going to be very hard to put numbers to it. Certainly, if you want to look at the numbers of China's migrant workers, that a conservative estimate would say 300 million. But one of the things I try to look at in the book is the idea that precarity is contagious. That we're seeing it spread from the margins to the so-called more socially sheltered cohorts. And I think that's actually the crux of the argument I'm making in the book. So that whereas once upon a time you could talk about precarity in terms of low wage, low skill, lack of household administration. Now people who've got the best kind of degrees are struggling to find their first job, or at least a job that seems commensurate with their skills and training and aspirations. So I think it's really hard to quantify, but that's, in a sense, that's part of the problem. I mean, it's a sense of, well, am I precarious or am I not? Do I belong to that number, and if I don't now, will I soon? I think that's the sense in which it becomes a feverish kind of contagion. And in terms of the UK and the US, I'm not a sociologist. I can't give those answers, but for sure, this is something which is happening absolutely everywhere. I don't need to give anyone in this room any instruction on this. But I do think that the conditions that I laid out in my talk, which pertain particularly and specifically to China, do make it, if not an exceptional case, one which particularly deserves our inquiry, any kind of inquiry that wants to get to grips with precarity.
So many follow-ups of my own, but the river.
When they have
Over here first,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
Rose River, and then Dr. Yeah, go.
As a reader of the Chinese contemporary literature, I find the new trend of the immigrant worker literature, such as 我在北京送快递，我的母亲做保洁，赶时间的人，一个外卖人的诗。Also, the popularity of our neighbor country, South Korea writer Eric Kim. My favorite work written by the Cantonese dialect Chao Xitu, published on the magazine 收获, also depicts a group of marginalized people in the modern China, which appears in Professor Ger's lecture, The Boat People. My question is, the seemingly the immigrant worker literature is distinct from the original voice of the picture that appears on the social media like the Kuaishou, or so I think there's a criticism that the gap between the ongoing writer and the original voice of underclass people. Like in the 2 decades ago, we know that a very famous TV shows depict a woman called Liu Xiaoyang. The title is Nora on the Plainland. So that's kind of like the original voice. On the TV shows, they can observe, we can observe their image on the TV. So I think nowadays they seems to be invisible in the like general public's observation or that. So what do you think of how can we like discover the underclass people, how to show our empathy on the regional or the actual living situation they have?
How should we show our empathy? When you say our, who's the we?
Now our, like, because I mentioned like the pick of the underclass people, like, I think the voice of themselves is very narrow, and the actual agency or the solidarity of the underclass people or the audience of the immigrant workers literature is very narrow. So how actually we can discover or how they can be observed in a more broader, like on the CCTV?
Right, that's a very important question. How does subaltern people, how do they break through into public discourse, into visibility and audibility, or auditory power, I should say. And I think that this is one of the problems that I tried to look at in the book, because as you know, many migrant worker poets have been quite sternly critiqued by literary pundits from established literary circles, who call their poetry too crass, too vulgar, too base, too discordant, because the diction it uses is the diction of the roaring machines, of amputated fingers, of fluorescent lights, of clocking on and off. It's not the language of poetry. So how does poetry like that break out into the mainstream? And I think the answer has been those migrant worker poets who have achieved a certain measure of success have often had to have to be stewarded by a broker of some kind. They've had to have some sort of quote unquote middle class helper smoothing their path into the literary establishment. You can see that in someone like Zheng Xiaoqiong, who started out as a migrant worker and has ended up as a literary editor. And how has she made that journey? She's made that journey by having advocates, people who've spoken for her. would it have been possible for her to make that journey had she not received the support of middle class literary brokers? That's a really big question, and it's one that Sun Wenling looks at in her work. But the problem is that if you want to join the mainstream, then you have to smooth out your rough edges. You can't. So the reason why this poetry became important in the first place was because it did seem in many ways unpoetic. It was making different kinds of noise. It was making harsh, discordant noises, and that's why it was an important poetic practice. But if you look at Jung's career, her poetry has got more and more melodious. It's become less and less about the factory. It's become more and more conventional, and maybe that's the ticket price for entry into the literary establishment. Maybe and as she's made it as a poet, she's travelled a long way away from the factory floor. Does that mean that she can still speak for other factory workers, or is she now? No, it's the classic story about rap, isn't it? No. How can you still once you've been deracinated, once you've been removed from your roots, can you still speak for them?
I think we have time for just one more question back there.
When they have elections on the local level, what kind of turnout do they get? Do they get low turnout or do they get high turnout?
I'm not the person you need to ask that question to. I'm not a political scientist. I'm a cultural studies person.
I'd be interested to know, because it would seem to me that if in fact the government isn't working for people, they're not going to vote. And that's why it might be reflected in the turnouts that they get. Thank you.
Lei, you have last comment?
No, the population that I think that's described here, they didn't have a chance to vote. But that's the short answer. But I just back to this question. I wonder if there's a generational element to this. I'm reviewing actually Hu Xiaotuo's Young and Restless. I don't know whether it's coming out, I think, from Cambridge Press. It's a fascinating study of precisely the kind of people, migrants, who in a way embraced the precarious living.
Yeah.
She was describing these day laborers who some of them were quite well educated, who roamed around on the Shenzhen streets. We didn't want to hold the factory job because that was too difficult and too disciplined, and they go and put in the days of work, make some money, then they spend the next 2 days in the internet cafe or do something else. They ran out of money, they come back, they refuse to get married, they're not interested in buying housing. So they seem to be, they're called the great gods of Sanghe, Sanghe Daxing. I learned about this by reading the book. So there seems to be, these are the second generation migrants. The migrants I study.
Or third.
Or third, yeah. So is that, is that generational thing might also be at play here.
I'm sure you're right. I'm not trying to suggest for a second that the structure of feeling that I'm talking about is the only one. I think there is a complementary partner structure of feeling which is about detachment, and that detachment expresses itself in things like tongue, in things like the Sangwelhua, in exactly the phenomenon you've just been describing, and that's also a solid structure of feeling. But that seems to be the one that so far has attracted actually more scholarly attention. Certainly, global media went wild for the whole lying flat thing. There was barely a news outlet anywhere that didn't report gleefully on that. And there's a sort of xenophobic cast as well to that sort of the gloating over workers down in their tools and saying they've had enough. And there's something I found a bit distasteful about the way that there was such a rush to report on that story. So I'm not trying to say this is the only thing going on. I think that negativity and antagonism are overlooked, and they deserve their moment in the sun too.
Well, very stimulating. Please join me in thanking Professor Hillenbrand for visiting us.